from. But our first question is what current field concerns are playing out in your classrooms or educational environments, and how are you addressing them as guys? And either of you can hop in on that first.
Marina, would you like to go first? Would you like me to? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I am John Michael DiResta, and I am uh, from Brooklyn, New York, which is the Lenape and Canarsie, the land of the Lenape and Canarsie people. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am an assistant professor of theater at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, where I run the directing program, and I also run our musical theater minor. I'm a director and dramaturg by trade. I mostly work on new work development, and I also work on theaters of queer liberation. I'm in the middle of a long-term project right now in which I'm excavating some lost queer plays from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and reckoning with how they resonate in our world today, which I've written about for HowlRound, which I imagine we'll get to. Um, in terms of, Ashley, could I just ask you to restate that question one more time so I answer it really specifically?
For sure. The idea is what current field concerns are playing out in your classrooms and how are you addressing them?
Yeah. So we're thinking a lot right now in our classrooms, in my classrooms at Drew, about the ideas of equity and the ideas of access, and in particular, how we can think about those questions expansively, holistically, and in as equitable a way as possible. That conversation, I think, has expanded a lot over the course of the last 5 years. We are now, I think, being a little bit braver about talking about things um, like class, like income, like finances, like as I teach my directing students, what does it actually cost to be a professional director? What does it actually take to have a directing career in New York, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C.? I encourage them to do research as to how their favorite directors not only honed their craft and figured out what their brand and their vision was on stage, but also how they afforded to put their shows up. How did they afford to start a theater company? The answers to those questions, as I think many of us know, are often not rooted in equity and not rooted in accessibility. So I think that we're really sort of struggling with and wrestling with the intersectionality of class justice, racial justice, gender justice, and those questions. And then the other thing that we're really talking with a lot, which I presented on yesterday in another panel, is what queer liberation means right now, what queer liberation means at a time when, I've had this ring on my finger for almost 10 years now, legally, federally, which is kind of mind blowing. And the world is also infringing upon queer rights, in particular, the queer rights of people who are not able bodied cis white men like me. So I think we're thinking about that a lot within the context of what is the intersection between the national conversation, how that resonates within our industry, and then how we wrestle with that within our classrooms. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as our day goes on. But what I find really exciting about my students right now is we're landing on some really, really interesting questions, and I think that they're really thrilled to ask more questions as opposed to delve into some need for definitive answers. So I'll pause there for the time being.
Thank you. Maybe Marina will pop over to you next.
Sounds great. Very exciting to hear about what you and your students are talking about in the classroom. I'm Marina, and I'm currently calling in from Palestine, where I've been for the past year doing fieldwork for my dissertation. I have my MFA in directing from the University of Iowa, focused primarily on new work, and have been a freelance director and dramaturg for some time, teaching along the way at various institutions. I'm currently at Stanford University. When I'm in the States, it's where I'm working on my PhD, and my PhD research is Palestinian performance from 2015 to 2025. So looking at performances in the past decade, focusing thematically, especially on Palestinian futurity, concepts of care and what that looks like, and also what the personal and political look like on stage. The classrooms that I've been in the most in the past year have been in Palestine, which has been an exciting and great thing. And so looking at teaching different workshops and teaching in different settings where the conversation is often about what is happening in theater here and what does it look like compared to what's happening in theater across the country and across the world. So being able to point to different ways that theaters are or are not talking about current situations and are using their voices in different ways to talk about challenges there. And in the United States, the conversations with my students tend to be what is happening outside of these classrooms. So what's happening across California, for instance, from Palo Alto to San Francisco can feel like a large void if a student doesn't have a car or easy access to see theater there. And so conversations around what does it mean to take what they're learning in the classroom and apply it, which is of course always the conversation, but I think that the generation that I've been talking with the most is, okay, and how can we be happy and successful doing those things? And can theater answer these questions we have about the world? Can theater talk about environmental justice in the ways that we need to see environmental justice talk about? Can theater really, I don't know, intersect on these interests that I have around justice across the world? And can that justice be reached if the topic is about the justice, but what we're seeing in the rehearsal room isn't justice? And so really rich conversations happening in the classroom, and excited to talk about them more throughout this panel.
Thanks, Marina. Hey, Daphne, thank you so much for hustling on over from your other session. We really appreciate it. So we're doing intros with a first question here. So if you wouldn't mind telling everyone your name, pronouns, your institutional affiliation, and where you're calling in from. And then the question at play is what current field concerns are playing out in your classrooms and how are you addressing them?
There we go. My name is Daphnie Sicre, and my pronouns are she, her, and ella. I love to say ella and put it down because when folks who speak Spanish, as soon as they see ella, they automatically know that I speak Spanish. And so sometimes it just takes writing down that, and that opens the gate for some folks. I teach at University of California, Riverside, and I'm calling in from the Gabrielino Tongva lands where I currently reside and teach as well. I primarily focus on, there's three different things I focus on actually. I started in an educational theater program. So I was looking at curricula and representation and identity, and that led me specifically to look at Afro-Latinidad and how are Latine and African-American folks being represented on stage, and what does it mean to be Black and Latine, and combining that and identity and representation in that spectrum. So that was where I first started. But because I have a background in educational theater, I also focus a lot on pedagogy and different ways of how are we teaching, creating inclusive curricula, creating curricula that is diverse, that is equitable, and all of those lovely initials that are being prohibited all across the country right now for us to say, DEI. And so, and anti-racist as well. And so I take pride in creating these cultural spaces where we are having these discussions. I specifically was hired at UCR to teach Latine theater and theater for social change, which is also what I'm interested in. And the third thing that I would have never thought in 1,000 years that I would be working on and researching is Latine and Caribbean musicals, and specifically new work. And so very excited to be diving into that. I run a fellowship institute in New York City with the Dramatists Guild, founded by Daryl Alejandro Holmes, called the Candela Fellows, where we bring in Latine and Caribbean folks from all over the world to come and learn about musical theater. So really exciting to be doing that. And so, and I share all these contexts of what I do because, what contemporary field concerns have I seen play out in my classrooms, right? Like I'm teaching Latine theater in LA this past spring while my students are getting kidnapped, ICE coming on campus, frantic, like text messages coming from all over the place. Don't go to classes, don't leave your house. Students being concerned about their parents not being able to leave their houses, not being able to work. Students being concerned about having students who are undocumented being like, I don't know what the future holds, Professor Secret. I don't know. I don't know if I can get an internship anymore. I don't know if I can afford to go to school anymore. I don't know if my documents are going to be disclosed and given to the public and someone's going to show up at my house, right? And so trying to teach Latina theater, which and film, which focuses so much on immigration and policy, while my students are living it, has been incredibly challenging and traumatic at the same time. So that's been really hard. And then, of course, teaching about representation and identity is the other sort of level that's also really hard to so many of our students because, they're just discovering who they are and who they want to be and what kind of stories do they want to tell. And so they're coming into the spaces questioning their own identities and what does it mean to have a Black or brown body on a stage? What does it mean to create a story with Black and brown bodies? And how is that different from white bodies on a stage? How is that different from a movie with all white folks in it? And so those are some of the, how I enter it's a lived experience, I think is the best way to put it. Because I'm an immigrant myself. And I am a US citizen, but part of me is sitting here being like, A, am I going to be fired because I got hired to teach Latina theater? And B, am I going to be kicked out of this country because I wasn't born here and neither were my parents, but they got them. So all of these lovely things. So yay, so excited to be teaching through all of this.
My goodness, thank you all so much for kicking us off in that way and for bringing so much of yourselves here to this conversation today. So as we just heard, you've all taught clearly at a variety of institutions across diverse student populations and courses with varied learning objectives. How does the changing focus of a class impact the place that the real world, in this case, the theater field, has in your curriculum, in your assignments, and in your goals for the class? And whoever wants to start can go.
I mean, I'll start, like I I teach in the quarter system. So the first quarter I was teaching theater history and it's really hard to show up and try to teach about theater history when stuff is happening. And so relating topics, one of the things I had to pivot consistently and do is, here I am teaching traditional theater history from a global perspective, but showing the examples of how history repeats itself. We were looking at the fall of the Roman Empire, and one of my students raises their hand and says, is America, you know, experiencing what the Roman Empire? Are we experiencing the decline of the US empire? And the whole class just went silent in that moment, right? And I was like, well, you know, well, it's different, but they're making those connections, right? And so in teaching a theater history class, right as our administration was changing, showing the patterns of why certain things are necessary and why certain history repeats itself, even if the history is thousands of years old. It was really enlightening for the students, but bringing in those current moments that are happening right now with this history that's thousands of years old. And then quarter ends, and then I'm teaching Latina theater. And so having to be very cognizant, theater and film, of what is literally happening outside of our doors and how that is affecting our students, and being very cognizant of like, how do I also try to bring in joy while they're coming into this space? How do I also bring in examples of positive representation so they can see resilience, they can see thriving, even though all of this stuff is currently happening, like not ignoring the realities that are happening outside their doors and what they're afraid of. And I mean, the university received emails, all the faculty received emails to be considerate of students not coming to class because of ICE.
I can speak to this a little bit from a perspective that is a little, I focus a little bit on sort of my students' quotidian day-to-day lives. And one of the things that I find a real struggle in terms of teaching theater is, and of course I have it right next to me, is this. And for those of you who might not be on video, just to describe, I'm holding up my cell phone right now. I'm holding up my iPhone. And what I find is that my students are really hungry for some binary based yes or no answers, and for an approach to evaluating work that is acceptable, unacceptable, appropriate, inappropriate, woke, not woke. They're really sort of invested in those kind of classifications, which I then point out is an extremely binary way of thinking about things in a world that's trying, in our world, which is trying to be less binary and non-binary. So one of the things that I really try to actively teach my students is how we hold more than one thing in our hand at once, and how we can lean into questions over answers. And that is sometimes really hard for them when the extent of their discourse and their engagement is an Instagram comment, is a quick TikTok video that explains the situation in 45 seconds. But I've actually developed some exercises that I think are really useful for this. One of the things that I do with all of my queer theater students, with all my queer studies classes, is we watch Paris is Burning, the sort of seminal late 1980s, early 1990s ballroom New York scene. And then the assignment for next class is everyone come to class in drag. And I'm very open as to what drag might mean. So for me, I show up for class in oversized patchwork pants and a gigantic Jerry Garcia t-shirt and a bucket hat and a hemp necklace. And my drag is high school drag. This was me in high school. And we talk about, okay, what was the story I'm telling? And then students were all different kinds of drag to class that day. And we have this incredible celebration that grows out of watching Paris is Burning. And then that night I assigned Bell Hooks's Is Paris Burning, which is an extraordinary, I would say, takedown of the movie Paris is Burning, and reveals it as something that is pulled from the white gaze and as an example of white feminism. And so then we have to wrestle with the fact that we take inspiration from this movie and the celebration of these remarkable queens, and this woman who we all really admire, Bell Hooks, is making some really powerful arguments as to why this movie should actually maybe be invalidated. And then we unpack the fact that within Bell Hooks's early 90s approach to this film, there's some material that might read as transphobic today. And all of these things are still true. We then try to develop a space where we can sit within the discomfort of this together, and we honor the fact that we're going to have different opinions on things like this, and we're going to feel differently about all of this, and we're coming at this from different perspectives. And that doesn't mean that any of them aren't right. It doesn't mean that any of them are wrong. What I like most about this is it actually brings us back to some really theatrical bases, which is how are we going to engage with each other in the room? And it actually allows the conversation to become about how we treat each other, how we feel about each other, making space, respect, things along those lines, which to me is why I first got involved with theater. That was what I learned in 9th grade in play rehearsal, being able to take that sort of ethos, even when we're dealing with these really challenging theoretical, political, civic, human rights-based questions. I find that it really resonates there even more.
I am thinking of a class, Middle Eastern theater and culture and politics class that I was working on in January so several months after the genocide in Gaza had begun. And it was a really strange time to try to navigate teaching because I was dealing with my own situations of what does this mean? Does any of this matter? What does it mean to show up for class in this way? And I knew the students were as well. And so I think, as we do in most theater classes, of having check-ins and warm-ups and kind of figuring out ways that we can help our bodies be in the space together and come into a feeling of community was especially important. But what I don't know, I was so struck by the fact that we needed to mourn together, and we needed to find ways to mourn the news that we were hearing or the things people were experiencing. One of the students in the class was from Gaza and had family there still. And also trying to figure out what these moments of joy could be, because white supremacy and like all aspects of colonialism try to steal joy. And so figuring out how we could find joy in the pieces that had been assigned and that we were trying to go through together. And so adding in assignments, which given the current famine, forced famine in Gaza, I feel strange talking about, but like the food is a big part of community. And so one of the assignments began to be, okay, do this homework assignment with food. It can be with your flatmates, it can be with other people in this class, but there needs to be a community around food here. You can cook it, you can, do something, and it should be cheap. Something that, anyone inshallah can afford. And so finding ways to have joy in those content areas too. And we were watching some pretty heavy films. And so we found that watching the films together was one way to cope, which I know seems really basic, but I think that in diaspora, and a lot of students were experiencing life in diaspora, maybe for the first time, that it's really hard to find community. And so we really focused on creating that together and knowing that we could mourn as we needed and we could find the joy as we needed, but that we had to allow space for all of it, which as I know is something that we all deal with again, but I say this as I'm still doing this now with myself every day currently, so still resonates.
Thank you all. I feel like in those responses, a thread I'm hearing across is this this idea of the real world, the outside the classroom world, as almost an incursion. That then the classroom is, you are using the classroom as a tool to create joy and to push back against the threat and to create not just the learning objectives, but to stabilize in a way. And that's really heartening to hear. I also really appreciate hearing the strategies that you've used toward that as you're talking about them. So we're going to shift next into a question that's a little bit more HowlRound focused. So for those who have joined us today, I'm actually just going to speak about what HowlRound is for a moment. So HowlRound, the online platform, is all of the content is curated or created by theater professionals, whether they are theater makers, administrators, educators, students, or some combination of all of those and beyond. Our online platform publishes essays and conversations in the HowlRound Journal, hosts podcast series on a variety of topics, and also live streams theater-related events from all over the world onto HowlRound TV, just as this panel is currently being live streamed onto HowlRound TV. Which means it will then be archived later indefinitely for you to bring into wherever you'd like to go next. So although our publication timeline might be longer than like a daily newspaper or a weekly newspaper, it's much shorter than traditional academic publishing, which allows HowlRound to platform the conversations and changes to the theater field in relation to the world in nearly real time. So in the classroom, HowlRound content can give students access to the conversations the field is having and make these kinds of connections that our panelists have begun to articulate for us. So my next question for you all is, what kinds of HowlRound content have you brought in to support conversations in your classrooms? Marina, I might put you on the spot first because you're the only one who hasn't gone first yet. Is that all right?
That sounds great. I want to bring up 3 examples from when I was teaching at Beloit College, and a shout out to Amy, my colleague from Beloit, who is in the room. But I, at the time, was finding that for every problem I was experiencing in the classroom, there was a HowlRound article to go along with it. And it was really refreshing and really helpful. So I have had a lot of trans and non-binary students, and we were frequently talking about how in the scenes that we were looking at in class or in the plays we were reading, that they weren't representing the things that the students wanted to put on stage. And the next morning in my inbox was the article, "My Gender is Hot Fire." And I was like, what? Okay, this is amazing. And so, it's in the chat, please look at it. Because I sent it to a bunch of students right away, and then I shared it in class. I think I printed several copies, and then we had some e-readers, so people were reading it. And they were like, we're gonna do a trans and non-binary monologues. And they did. And it was really like, this article started of like, okay, of course we can write our own monologues. Of course we can tell our stories like this. And Kay Woodzik, who wrote the article, they had created a website that had a bunch of trans and non-binary monologues. So when the students that year auditioned for KCACTF, they pulled monologues from the site. And it just felt like, oh, okay, I think something gets clicked into place here. So it was seeing representation, knowing you could create your own representation, and having those things go hand in hand. That semester felt like it really shifted something. That semester was also teaching in one of the teaching classes. It was directing a play, and we were working on Brecht, which is always exciting and often a load. But one of the students came to me at the end of rehearsal and said, I don't know that I can do this lead role that I have, because I really feel like my chronic illness it's too much, and I don't know, and I just don't think that people with chronic illnesses are successful in theater. And I said, well, I have a chronic illness, so I'm with you, and we can navigate this together and figure out how maybe this space is ableist in ways that I haven't identified, that we haven't talked about as a group. And within the week, there was an article on chronic illness and disability through HowlRounds. And I don't remember the title, but I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat. Because again, I was like, oh, okay, let's talk about these ways that we can look at chronic illness together. And even just talk about it and bring up the conversation in class and the classroom, and the rehearsal room. And then the last example, and there were plenty more, but this one was my directing class. We had been looking at a bunch of man directors, and the students were like, okay, great, they're good. And the women, I was like, the women are here for sure. But one of them then was like, I read that Wikipedia has less articles on women in general than on men. It's like, that might be true, I'm not sure. But there was a HowlRound article that I had seen recently on a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. So I introduced the idea, and for those of you who don't know, a Wikipedia edit-a-thon is people getting together, usually in a group, and editing Wikipedia articles and creating Wikipedia articles for people who don't have them. So they knew that there was a paper coming up on the syllabus, and they said, in place of this paper, we propose that we edit Wikipedia pages for different women directors and some non-binary directors. And I said, okay, let's figure out how to do this and how to make it work. But we did. We exchanged the next writing assignment, which was going to be about a professional director who was living, and then their techniques and how it related to this own director's experience directing. So this sounds like a fair exchange. So HowlRound introduced us to the Wikipedia edit-a-thon based on concerns the students were having about the lack of information around women and non-binary directors. So those are three of my favorite examples from the classroom. I felt like they were all just really responsive. Somehow HowlRound knew what was happening in the classroom and was really taking us to a different place.
I can go next. I was just gathering all of the articles to share, and I think I have them now, so I can have this ready for y'all when I'm like, and all of these things. So I have two examples. One is myself creating the content for HowlRound to then use in my classrooms. And so I'll go with that, and then I'll share two examples of content that I did not create that I love to use in my classrooms. So first is, I'm gonna press return so you can get to all of these. First is, last year I was through LTC, I was one of the champions for Encuentro, which meant that I was helping create all the programming behind Encuentro. And part of that was like, do we live stream this programming? Do we not live stream this programming? And so I pushed to live stream the programming, obviously. And I came up with this one panel that I thought that I wanted to have us do and create. And it was Breaking Barriers, Building Legacies, Latinas in LA Theater, where I already knew these women because I live in LA. And so I specifically reached out to 4 different Latinas in LA who've been doing theater for almost 40 to 60 years, and to come in and have a tribute to them and their legacy, but also talk about their experiences. And I did this because I did not see enough examples of Latina actors who have been in the industry doing this for X amount of years, right? And so it was really incredible to be like, oh, I know if this gets live streamed, there's will be an archive, and then I can use it in my classroom. And so this happened in the fall, and I literally was able to use this as an example for my students in the spring. And it was wonderful because I had so many students, especially young women in my class, be so moved by this panel, so moved by the women in this panel and everything that they had to share, and how these women were talking about their experiences as actors for the past 40, 50 years, how they've been directors, how they have survived and thrived, but also encountered lots of issues. So that was one thing that I helped sort of uh, create through being in this position of power of being part of the Encuentro and being able to create what programming. And then again, thinking of like, well, if I create this programming, hey, I'm honoring these women who I love, but then I'm also creating a forever existent material that anyone can learn from these women. So 50 years from now, when these women are no longer here, you can still learn about them and their stories through this panel and their contributions. And not everyone knows about them. And so that made me really excited. The other is a spin-off off of the Super Friends playwriting hour that Tablo created during COVID, and I loved it. And so I wanted to focus specifically on Afro-Latinidad because that is what is my research is on, and a lot of things that my scholarship is on. And so I reached out to HowlRound and said, can I do first I reached out to Tablock and I said, can I do this? And he was, yes. And then I reached out to HowlRound and I said, can we do this? And we said, yes. And I brought in 8 different playwrights. This has been incredible to use in my solo performance classes, in my Latina theater classes, because each of these playwrights, it's a masterclass. It's an hour masterclass that each of these playwrights is talking about techniques and different strategies that they use as playwrights, as artists, and they're all Afro-Latina. And so this is another thing that I helped create because I wanted to create it. But then I use it in my classrooms. Like when a student is like, Melissa Dupree has this great presentation on solo performance and how to create your own solo show. Boom, I send that to someone. They're like, oh my God, like in an hour, they have a whole conceptual framework of what they could do. There is Josefina Baez is introducing her techniques of acting, and there's a whole exercise. And I love showing that to students, and because they're blown away by her work and what she's having folks do within this sort of hour. They're like, you did what? And they don't believe it. Then they get to watch it. So really, really great source that, of course, I helped curate, but then I can use it, which is so wonderful. And this is part of why I love HowlRound, not only because of clearly current articles that are happening that I can put in my classroom immediately, but I can brainstorm something that could be accessible for people and then I can use for many years. And then I sort of wanted to share 2 articles that I loved that I also share in my classes. One is the Latinx Theater Leaders at the Forefront. I love this. It's a combination of, I had nothing to do with this. It's a combination of artistic directors, Latina artistic directors in conversation. It is excellent, again, for my students in my Latina theater class, but it is excellent for anyone interested in learning about artistic theaters, artistic directors, and how they work. And artistic directors have been running theaters for 20, 30, 40 years, and someone who's just starting. These conversations are fantastic. They're great learning tools because it teaches something else about the industry. It's not just about acting, right? It's learning like, how is a theater run? And a lot of our students sometimes want to create their own theaters, right? But they don't even know where and how to begin or the struggles that they will be coming up with. So this series, I love showing it to them when I'm introducing them to Latina theaters across the country. And then they see real human beings who run these theaters. So, and then the other article, which I have used so much and shared in so many spaces, is the Whiteness, Patriarchy, and Resistance in Actor Training text, reframing actor students as embodied critical thinkers. I love this because this article specifically critiques Ball, what's his name? Oh yeah, William Ball, right? And I remember when I was younger and I was studying theater and I was reading A Sense of Direction, I felt like the text was racist, right? But I didn't have anyone to talk about. Like, how was I going to turn to my white professor and be like, this text is a little racist? Like, I'm like, you're asking for me to define beauty, but the way that it's defining beauty is so problematic. And I also teach directing, but I've shared this with so many people in so many spaces because I was finally able to find an article that expressed exactly how I felt about this text that's so loved and is used all over the world, especially to teach directing. And this article allowed me to then justify why I'm finding it different. I went and I found a director who's got a book, I can't remember the name of that book right now, to use in my directing classes instead of using a sense of direction that again is beloved and people love to use, right? And so it's just a great critique and something that I felt for decades, but didn't have the words or articulate it, and also didn't have the courage to be like, this beloved text that all these people love, I think is racist and misogynistic. And so it's great to have someone else publish it, be able to be like, look at this article, yay, and reaffirm what I was thinking.
I want to talk a little bit also about teacher support in addition to classroom, because these things come together. HowlRound for me is one of the most extraordinary places just for an informal bit of professional development, professional collegiality. I can connect with my fellow educators, my fellow theater makers, and find community. And I can just sort of give an example of one way in which that's impacted my teaching, which I'll put in the chat now, which is this article, The Queer Theater We Need Now by David Valdez, which was really instrumental for me. I teach a first year seminar called More Life, Queer Performance and the AIDS Epidemic. And it's a survey of theater related to the AIDS epidemic, theater made about, during, responding to the AIDS epidemic. It begins with the normal heart, it ends with a strange loop, and we cover everything in between, both in terms of what was on stage. Obviously, we spend a lot of time with Angels in America. We look at contemporary plays like 1 and 2 and The Inheritance. We also look at performance art. We look at Reza Abdo. We look at protest as art, Ray Navarro, things along these lines. This is the first year seminar, and what I heard from my students over and over and over was, oh God, I want to take this as an elective class. I want to take this class. I want to take this class. How come only the first year students get to take it? It's not fair. And then I offered it as an upper level class, and it did not get enrollment. And we did not, and it was a small liberal arts college, not a huge pool, but we did not meet the minimum number of students. And I went to my students, some of my favorite students, and said, wait a minute, why aren't y'all taking this class? And the response that I heard across the board was, John, it just seems like a downer. I mean, it just feels like it's going to be such a depressing class. And so I altered the class and made it into a class about 21st century queer theater. And we just sort of looked at a wide range of queer theater pieces made over the last 20, 25 years. And then I sort of stealthily included in the middle of it, queer theater of the 21st century responding to the AIDS epidemic. So they did still read The Inheritance. They did still read 1 and 2. They did still engage with A Strange Loop. But it was really hard for me because I am a child of the 80s, and it was sort of one of the first times that I found myself experiencing a new queer generation saying, like, I actually don't want to know about what you went through. I actually don't want to know about what happened. And that became very hard when put in conversation with when I asked students about, like, hey, do you know what PrEP is? Do you know what pre-exposure prophylaxis is? Do you know what antiretrovirals are? Do you know what a cocktail is? And sort of across the board, they didn't. So those things were hard to wrestle with in common. But then I found David's article, and I found that I was not the only person who was dealing with a new generation of queer students saying, we want queer joy exclusively. What was really exciting about this was I was then able to write my own article, which when I finish speaking, I'll put in the chat, about the mixture between balancing joy and trauma within a queer space. I really sort of stick to my guns that if you are a queer theater maker of this time, if you are a queer theater person of 2025, man, you got to know your history. That's really important. You better have read James Baldwin, and you better be familiar with the normal heart, and you better be able to critique these pieces and take these pieces apart and understand them and honor them and recognize that we wouldn't be here without Mae West. And that is really important. And it also brought me forward to understanding that in a world, again, in which our students are constantly exposed, I'm holding up my cell phone, constantly exposed to traumatic content, a world in which our students were doing shooter drills when they were in kindergarten, which I, of course, was not, they are engaging with this material differently. So what I was able to do with HowlRound was write about this. I was able with HowlRound to talk about how by assigning my students, thank you, David, again for the suggestion, by having my students watch Joel Kim Booster's Fire Island film, I was able to give them that queer joy that they were demanding, and then also able to say, hey, this is just an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, in the same way that The Inheritance is an adaptation of Howard's End, in the same way that Angels in America is Tony Kushner's attempt to write a Brechtian play about the AIDS epidemic, in the same way that all of these pieces rely on the queer ancestors that came before them and the queer tropes that came before them. I was able to proffer trauma and joy, again, not as a binary, but as constellational, intersectional, interrelated entities. And I was even able to propose, hey, maybe when we as a group together process this traumatic content, that can actually be joyful. Maybe there's a world in which Paula Vogel is giving us a model in the Baltimore Waltz and turning the death of her brother into a comedy. Maybe there's actually something within there that we can rely on together, which I was able to write about. I'm now able to offer that essay as a model for my students and invite them to write their same material. And I will also just say that for me personally, writing that article then led to this larger project that I'm doing, excavating these lost queer plays from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which I then wrote another article about for HowlRound, both of which I'll put in the chat. So I think that what HowlRound has really provided is this sort of example of symbiosis, this example of a sort of multi-platform engagement, which is really, really exciting. And I think allows our students both to read the material, but also gives them a model for engagement that we can then assign them and they can then complete as assignments.
Amazing. Thank you.
Just the next question. I was going to briefly put on a little bit of a panelist hat for this one, just because I, for several years, taught theater history at the high school level at a public school in New York City, where I used some HowlRound content as well, in addition to some of the things that y'all are talking about, which is that because my students had their humanities block as well, with English and history on top of theater history, and we actually ask so much of high school students, I was often assigning them HowlRound's podcasts. So, and I just haven't heard that come up quite yet, and I want to lift those up as a valuable resource. They always have transcripts with them, so students can choose to listen or read. I have assigned Kunafa and Shay, the podcast that Marina does with Nabra Nelson. There's a great season that's all theater history centered, and that was really exciting. I've also, the Theater History podcast has this great episode about Ernie McClintock. If you're trying to pull on queer threads in the Black Arts movement, as I was at that time, and trying to make the Black Arts movement perhaps not as like monolithic as sometimes it can come off if you only have a little bit of time to talk about it in a class. And then the one other episode I'll lift up from another great podcast is the Daughters of Lorraine podcast. Has this great episode. Well, actually, I've assigned many of their episodes, but I was at one point dramaturging the school's production of Lisa Loomer's Roe, which is about the people behind the Roe v. Wade case. But my students and the script calls for a cast of, I think, like maybe 9 white actors and 2 actors of color, and those were not the demographics at the public school in New York. We had very few white students in the cast, and so my students of color were like, where are we in this story? How are we doing this? And this episode, do I have it? Yeah. Oh, I put it in there twice. That's fine. Staging Reproductive Freedom in Black Feminist Theater builds out a really beautiful narrative of reproductive freedom in plays by Black writers, and kind of cracked open a wider story of the fight for reproductive freedom that allowed my students to carve out their own spaces in that production of Roe. So that's my one little panelist moment, and then I'll go back to being moderator now, and I'll pass back to Ramona for our next question.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. Sorry for almost cutting you off there. Yeah, I love that. I always love to hear about the idea of HowlRound in a high school classroom. Amazing. So, John, you sort of perfectly led us into this next question, which is just, you've all contributed to HowlRound too. And I would love to hear a little bit more about what you've all contributed and how it has impacted your teaching or research. Marina, maybe you can kick us off here because you just got a shout out from Courtney in the chat about Kunafa and Shay.
Thanks, Courtney. And yeah, I co-host Kath and Shay with Nebra Nelson, and it's kind of a dream. So a quick backstory is that when I was teaching at Beloit, I taught a class called Arab Theater and Culture, and it focused on plays from Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Palestine. And I'd been to 3 of the 4 countries. So I was frequently bringing in my friends to Zoom. I was like, oh, this Egyptian friend who does street theater, or this Palestinian friend who is the artistic director of this theater. And the students would often, though, they heard me talk about Zaina Dakash, who does theater in Lebanon, and it has led to a lot of justice in the carceral system by her bringing people to the theater, to the prison, doing theater work with the imprisoned folks, and then having that piece be about a particular problem in those prisons, and then having legislators come and watch the piece, and then helping draft legislation that has then changed. For example, people were sentenced to particular sentence lengths, but no one was getting off early for good behavior. Or people were in prisons with mental health issues and no treatment, alongside people who did not share those mental health issues. And so her work has changed the game in these different places. And students were like, we really want to know more about these things. And I thought, oh, and so I eventually went to go get a PhD to do some of this work. And then when I started the PhD, I really thought, oh, all day I'm going to be in conversations with people who want to talk about Middle Eastern theater all day long. And that was just not true. And that's fair. That's not everyone's area of research or interest. But I was like, oh, who do I talk to about these things? Nebra, do you want to start a podcast? And she said yes, thankfully. But I found that all of these things that the students that I had been teaching at Beloit wanted, I thought, okay, we can sort of do these things with podcast episodes. We can see what interests us and let that guide us, but also to see what conversations we feel are happening in the field with our folks. We have an ATHE, Middle Eastern theater group. We have one at Astor. We have all of these groups who are having conversations, but we wanted to figure out if we could unify them in some way, or at least bring those conversations to the forefront. And I couldn't believe it when we wrote to HowlRound and we were like, we have this idea. What do you guys think? And they were like, sure. So very gratefully heading into season 6. But it's really helpful because sometimes when I say that I work on Palestinian theater, people are like, there's theater in Palestine, which yes, there is a lot. And here I can send you some links that are us talking about them, or interviews with Palestinian theater artists. Yesterday and today through ATHE, I'm sure many of you saw, but I'll put in the chat that Mona Mehri, ATHE, HowlRounds, and Golden Thread are looking at these Syrian performances that we have the privilege to watch, which is extremely rare and exciting. So I don't know, I've just found that getting to work on this podcast has been great. Sometimes other scholars are like, stop, because you need to save some of this to publish in a different place in a different way, or else you'll never get tenure at a supposed institution that might hire you in the future. And I was like, I don't think that's the case. I think public scholarship is quite rich. And the fact that then people will email and say, oh, I've used this in my classroom. Yeah, that's what we want, is that our scholarship is not behind a paywall, and people can access it. And the fact that there are transcripts for the podcast is amazing on so many levels, but especially an accessibility level. So very grateful for that, and grateful for the other podcasts. I'm a huge Daughters of Lorraine fan. And so I would just always feel like, oh, these are celebrities to me. And yeah, that's very grateful.
I want to jump in really quickly because I've used 2 of your podcasts in my classes as homework, because my students prefer listening to a podcast than reading, and they will listen to a podcast before reading. They just won't. They just how it is. And I tell them, I'm like, you could be cooking, you could be driving, you could be taking the bus, just listen, and they will. And they actually, it's amazing. 100% they will listen to a podcast before reading 10 pages. Your podcast could be an hour long. And so I've used 2 of them in my theater history class. And there's something magical, I think, also about the podcast that I've noticed with my students, where they it's almost like I can say what I can say X, Y, W, Z. They don't believe me. But then if they hear the podcast, they believe me. Like it's like the real person behind, like no matter, it's like the mom that says, don't do this. They don't want to listen to the mom, but they'll listen to the auntie. It's the same thing. And so there's something really magical. And it's just, and also know that the right university is going to accept all of the work that you're doing. The university that I'm in right now is accepting my public scholarship that I've done with HowlRound towards my tenure. They're not excluding it and being like, no. Some universities will not, I'll be honest. But the right university, which is where you'd want to go anyway, would accept all of what you've done in your public scholarship. And now there's also a huge discourse that's being introduced on public scholarship and the importance. And so again, some universities still don't understand that, but the right university will accept it, embrace it, and they will accept all of the work that you've done towards that huge tenure packet. So instead of 7 years, you could go up in 2 years. Just saying, because the right places will do that.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
I spoke a lot to this. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say I spoke a lot to this in my last answer, so I won't repeat what I said last time. But I also will just say, for our students today who are learning to research in a way that is very, very different than the way that we learned to research, I find that HowlRound is an incredibly useful tool because our students are very well trained in link-based research. They're very well trained in essentially Wikipedia research, which is you read an article and then it links to something else and it links to something else, and that's how you learn. And what is exceptional, I find, about HowlRound is that's a really easy way for them to enter the dialogue towards research, and that's a really good on ramp. But HowlRound also the arguments are not pop arguments. They are rationed and scholarly and informed, and they also do this extraordinary thing of mixing both research and scholarship and also lived experience. And there's some autoethnography in there. These things are all present there. So it's a really good on-ramp for students to begin that kind of Wikipedia-based research. And it then invites students to go further because there's deeper citations, there is deeper research within there. And there is a lot of relying not only on primary sources, but also secondary sources. It introduces theory. So I find that it's just a very holistic way and a very, very effective way to get students to go deeper from a research perspective.
And universities are really starting to understand the value of this. And a lot of it sometimes has to do with like, oh, this many people participated in my Afro-Latine playwriting series, right? There were this many people that were live. There were this many people who were present while it was being live streamed. So there was these many people in the room, these many people, and then it has been archived because HowlRound will archive it, and X amount of people have seen it, right? Unfortunately, sometimes you have to go by numbers. And so in some of these institutions, you can prove the impact on numbers, right? Versus like, can you prove that obscure peer-reviewed journal that no one can buy, it's not accessible in any libraries except maybe a Research One institution has read that, right? Like how many people have read that and have access to that one article? Or how can you prove that article is being taught versus like with the accessibility of open scholarship like this? HowlRound has the numbers, right? Then HowlRound, because I've been able to turn to HowlRound and be like, how many people were streaming it or how many, and then I was able to grab the numbers and be like, I'm gonna put this in my tenure file, this many people. And then I'm able to go to the YouTube and be like, oh my God, 100 people have watched this. And while 100 might not seem like a lot, 100's a lot. It's a lot of people that are looking into our scholarship that we've created or that we've put together. So for me, it's always really exciting to see spaces and universities and that are really starting to embrace this kind of scholarship, because John, you're absolutely right. It's so accessible to students. This is what they're going to find. This is what they're going to read or listen to or watch. And it becomes so much more palatable to them than some obscure journal that, I can't even read it. English is my second language, but I sometimes open some of these journals and I don't even know what it says. And I can't even assign that to my student if I don't understand it. How can I assign that to my student to read versus, again, HowlRound is accessible. They don't have to pay for it also, which I think is so important. So for me, I love assigning it as a text, right? As a homework text, because they don't have to. I hate when you have to buy a $150 textbook and you're only using an excerpt from that textbook, or when you are, whatever, however, all those things are. It's so much easier to be able to provide the link and that they can read it at any place at any moment without having to worry of having to go get these things.
Thanks so much, y'all. We've got one more question before we head into a bit more of like an open question. So I'm starting to see the chat populate. Feel free to throw questions in there, folks. But our last question, and we have touched on this, is that HowlRound also does have content on pedagogy. We've got a whole tag for theater education, pedagogy, and training. Everyone here would probably find some really useful things there. And shout out to John's work on HowlRound that is explicitly contributing to that conversation about pedagogy. So I was wondering for our panelists, have you used HowlRound in that way to impact pedagogy? We've heard some yes already, but are there any other ways that HowlRound has come in to impact your teaching that we haven't had the opportunity to think through yet?
The syllabi builder. You read 4 articles on HowlRound and you've got half your syllabi built just from that. I never would have thought to assign Joel Kim Booster's Fire Island movie if I hadn't read David's article about it. I'm so grateful for that. So I think that it is just a quick way to amass resources. And this is really quality secondary material. This is the kind of writing, in particular when I teach first year seminars. Man, if at the end of the first year seminar a student is ready to write an HowlRound article, I've succeeded. It's just I find such a wonderful way to get their brains working, to think about what they can be writing themselves. And the last thing I'll say there also, and this is the thing that is sort of the elephant in the room, and I grow really annoyed that we're not talking about this more. I once, for fun, tried to have ChatGPT write a HowlRound article, and it can't be done. They're terrible. So it's kind of AI proof, which I also just really, really value today, and I think is really important.
Just quickly, something I value for myself and also for my students is staying connected to conversations in the field. And because I've been in Palestine for the past year, I am part of major conversations that are extremely important to me. But I also want to make sure that I'm not missing out on larger conversations that are also important, that intersect with the conversations I'm having here as well. And so really HowlRound has been a lifeline for me in many ways, of helping me know what is happening. What are my colleagues in the United States talking about that maybe we're not talking about on a phone call, but that I see in print through HowlRounds, or that I'm hearing in this podcast. So I'm really grateful for the way that it's allowing me to focus on my research and able to do a deep dive there and to share that research, but also where I feel like I'm able to still be of service to the students by really knowing what's taking place and what conversations are most important.
I just added to the chat. I loved when the lesson plans came out for theater educators. I remember I was in when HowlRound was deciding if they were going to do this or not, and I was one of the people that HowlRound asked, "Should we do this?" I was like, "Yes, please," and I love it. While I haven't used the specific lesson, right? I love reading the lesson and then coming up with how this can be used in my class for my students. And so some of these have been really interesting when I sit there and I'm like, oh, I'm thinking about doing this. What has someone else done, right? And I loved it because it's a series, like there's some great, like embracing community, radical accessibility, right? Or I love the one that's looking at whiteness is not the standard, disruptions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, theater makers, right? These things are going beyond diversity statements. This is great because these lessons are already created for us, right? And so I as an educator, as a background in theater education, I love looking at lesson plans, love seeing what other people have done. So I have used these, not the lesson plan itself, but as a building block for what I wanted to teach. Like when you're, oh my God, I got to teach tomorrow and I'm stuck and I want to change this class, but I don't, because last time I taught it, it didn't work. To have a place to just look at what someone else is conceiving as a possible lesson, it's so helpful because then, Marina, similar to what you're saying, then you're sort of in conversation, even though it's just a document, but you're in conversation with that educator that created that lesson plan. Because then I can look at that lesson plan and be like, oh, I like this. This is going to work with my students. Oh, I didn't think about that. Oh, that's a great question. I'm going to add that, and then I can create my own lesson. But I have found those. I was really excited when they came out. I was excited when the book came out as well. I thought that was fantastic, especially because essays and conversations from the first 10 years. It's this sort of summary also and celebration of what HowlRound has been able to do and foster for folks. But then to have a lesson plan on how to teach a special essay is also so much fun. Like I already do that myself, but I still like seeing other people's examples of what they do because it gets my mind thinking.
That's brilliant. Thank you all so much. I feel like I've learned so much about like I am in the HowlRound website every day, and I've learned so much in the past hour-ish about what HowlRound is outside of myself, and outside of what I think about it. Thinking about that word commons, that HowlRound is a commons, and that the commons is like stewarded for, created by, and owned by a whole community of participants. It feels to me like it's really functioning that way in the classroom, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm going to open us up a bit into questions and responses from those who are joining us right now. You're welcome to direct questions to any of the panelists, to myself and Ramona, to the group. And if you have any specific questions about HowlRound, Ramona's going to drop our emails into the chat, and we're happy to chat with folks outside of like conference times as well. So our first question is actually coming from the folks over on the live stream chat. It says, how do you balance between a more vocational job training approach and a liberal arts approach in your classrooms in preparing your students for careers in theater? Does anyone want to hop in on that?
I mean, sure. I'm a professional director and a professional dramaturg, right? And so I think that right there is how you start sort of having conversations of what my personal experience is. Like my students will know, like when the spring quarter started, I was in in tech. And literally I was like, my second class I had to be in tech. Couldn't teach. And I was like, y'all, this is how it is. And I'm like, tech starts at 10 o'clock and will not end until X amount of time, and it's very realistic because that becomes the sort of vocational part for them to see that I'm a practitioner, not just a scholar. I'm actually doing the work as well. And I think that the balance is just me and my lived experience and them seeing like, oh, today I have a reading tonight. I have to leave class because I have a reading or I have to go to rehearsal and I'm driving away an hour to make sure that happens. And just being very honest with them or being like, oh, I'm working on this dramaturgical piece and this is what I did. And these are the changes from the original piece. And so knowing that as practitioners, I self-identify as a multi-hyphenated theater practitioner, theater artist. And I use that in my classroom to be able to be like, vocationally, this is what I do professionally. And then, traditionally, this is the history when I teach like theater history. And so being able to give examples also, even when I teach theater history, because they love real life examples, like when I did this or when I did that, or, oh, this play, and thinking about the research that comes with this play and things like that. So that's how I balance it, sort of like, because I'm both, I'm able to just talk about my lived experiences and then bring students on the journey, right? So sometimes I'm able to bring students to observe my professional spaces as my assistant directors or an assistant dramaturg and giving those opportunities for them to be able to experience the real life setting of what that looks like as well, or inviting them to a professional rehearsal. I mean, like, you can come in today and observe how a professional rehearsal is being run in a space, and you can follow the stage manager if that's what you're interested in, and things of that sort.
Thanks so much. John and Marina, did you have anything to add there, or you feel like that covers?
Dramaturgy requirement for graduation.
Ooh, absolutely. We got an amen in the chat.
If your student is studying how to be a dramaturg, they're learning the practicality, vocational training necessary to put up a play, and they're getting a liberal arts education. It is the same thing together. So I think that whether it's a liberal arts, a BFA, I don't care what program you are, your students have to take a dramaturgy class, and you are succeeding in both training them to be theater makers and training them to be scholars in one 4-credit class. What could be better?
Wow, so efficient. That's incredible. Thank you. Our next question in here comes from Andrew, who asks, what value does peer review have in our future scholarship models? That might be a whole session, if not conference on its own, but if anyone wants to give us a little nugget of what do you think the value of the peer review model is in our future scholarship models?
I mean, I'm going to say this really fast. HowlRound is peer reviewed. It's just a different type of peer review, right? I'm not just submitting an essay and it's just getting magically published. Ashley's going through my work very digitally.
Yeah, I'm sending you notes. Yeah.
As well as other folks, right? First, you have to be selected, in whatever you're proposing has to be approved by the panel of and folks at HowlRound. So that's number one. So that's already a whole thing. And then two, I've gone through like 3 review process before things are. So I think that, I just want to put that in there instead of answering the full question.
I'm going to pass on that question until I'm tenured.
Yeah, no, fair.
I mean, I currently don't have a job.
Yeah.
But as a PhD candidate, I have to say the amount of people of color, specifically in this instance, people writing about Middle Eastern theater, who submit to places and then are told in the peer review process that they must cite X and Y dead white man in order for that paper to be published is absurd. And I really struggle with that. And I'm glad when I see my colleagues pull those papers. So this is my experience right now with peer review.
Marina, and it's going to continue to be, I was publishing on Afro-Latina theater and no one else had published on Afro-Latina theater. Like, one article had been published, it was written by Olga, and I had peer reviewed that article. Olga had sent it to me before she got it peer reviewed, and then the peer reviewer sent it to me. I was like, oh, approved. And literally, and I had folks literally ask me, where's the archive? And this is, to me, why also HowlRound is so important, because HowlRound becomes an archive of digital scholarship that is accessible to anyone, right? So once you publish in HowlRound, Marina, I can quote you. Like, I can go and quote all of these podcasts, right? So these podcasts are now the scholarship. So if I were to be writing about XYWZ, I can go to and I can quote you, because now you're the expert in this because you have this scholarship in this podcast. And to me, this is a breakthrough with this sort of requirement of like peer review, because it allows for those of us in the space that are doing scholarship that has never been published before because of that second reviewer, that really HowlRound breaks that sort of barrier for us, because then we can now quote the work that we have been doing. And we're like, and I'm going to say this, like, in so many spaces, I see white scholars quoting themselves. And it was really awkward for me to start quoting myself and all my scholarship. But my mentors were all like, no, you gotta be a white man. Go ahead, quote yourself. I was like, all right, this is so weird. But I realized I now have spaces that are public spaces and digital spaces. And once I went through that first article that book chapter that first got published, I can now, but now I think for you, Marina, it's very exciting to think about your scholarship and what you're going to be able to do, because you have all of this digital scholarship that you can quote, and no one can take that away from you, whether they like it or not. But you're right, those peer-reviewed journals. I mean, I literally had someone tell me they went to Google to verify something, and I was like, oh my God. I'm like, you didn't see the play. I saw the play. I was present. You're reading something that's in a then they use Google Translate. That was the other thing. They use Google Translate to try to contradict. Well, Google Translate says this about the play. I was like, yes, but I speak Spanish and I saw the play. But it is how it is, and we can't change that. But the fact that there's a space like HowlRound that provides us to be able to publish scholarship that other people have never published allows us to build a space to then go, if we want to have that first peer review article, we can now quote ourselves from all the scholarship that we have already published in all these other spaces. So I'm excited for you.
Sharing. No, thank you for sharing those stories, and I really appreciate hearing your experience. I mean,
it's gonna happen. You're gonna continue.
Yeah.
So just F them and cite yourself, and you have, I mean, I'm using your work in my class, right? In my theater history class, I've used 2 of your podcasts. Like that's pretty freaking kick-ass, right? When you sit down and think about it, I want you to walk away and be like, holy shit, my work's being used in the theater history class, right? Like that's amazing to me. And I'm not using a peer review article on XYWC. I'm using your podcast. That to me is more valuable than anything else.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I love this exchange. We have one more question that came in through the HowlRound TV chat, but before I ask that, I just want to see if there's anybody here in the room that wanted to chime in either with a question or to answer maybe one of these questions, share anything about your own experience.
Just a
Yeah.
just a quick shout out as someone who also works in adult ed spaces, and writing groups at the individual theater companies, that all of these things you're saying also apply to those spaces. So if anyone is working in those spaces, this is great for those as well. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, and thank you for being here. Fantastic. Then this might be our last question. So from the chat, we have, what sorts of things do you find your students are most excited about or passionate about when it comes to entering the field right now? Are you able to shape your teaching around that in any way?
I'll share representation when they see themselves on stage, when I introduce them to Latine plays that they didn't know about, and it's their stories. It's like, so many of my students came into the classroom and they wanted to write sci-fi, and they weren't thinking about who those sci-fi characters are. I'm like, great, we love sci-fi, right? I do. I'm a big Star Wars, get Marvel, DC, bring it on. But then I brought in the sort of well, who are those characters, right? If you're writing sci-fi, if you're writing horror, a lot of my students want to do horror. My department is theater, film, and digital productions. And now they're like, oh, I want to do a horror film, and the characters are going to be Latine. Yes, right? It's like, yeah, why? Oh, because you haven't seen that. And now you've seen the value of what it means to see yourself on stage. And so I think my students become really passionate when they see themselves for the first times, whether it's on stage or whether it's on film, because they hadn't seen themselves. And I want to continue to be flourishing that. And I keep telling the students, I was like, I need y'all to contribute to the field. I want y'all to win the awards. I want y'all to go to the festivals. First time I shared with my students, I had them Google, top of the class, I had them Google Latine festivals for theater, for film. And because again, a lot of them are film majors. And all of a sudden, they had no idea so many film festivals, specifically for Latina students, existed. And within even the radius of where they're at UC Riverside, they have the Chicano Film Festival. They have the Latin American LIFA Film Festival. They have one in San Diego. All of a sudden, they were like, oh my God, there's a one in Orange County. They realized they could apply to all these Latina film festivals with their stories and have their films being pictured and seen, and they were blown away by that. And the same thing went with theaters and Latina theaters when they saw that there's all these Latino theaters in LA and what they're doing and how they're trying to, they just didn't know. And so that got them really excited to know that there are spaces where they can create their stories, and there are spaces that will tell their stories.
I really appreciate this question, and I'm just realizing this. So I'm speaking in draft here, and it might take me a second to figure this out. My students are so enthusiastic about musical theater in a very exciting way, and I have found that across institutions. And they are excited about weird, hard musical theater. They love A Strange Loop. They love Fun Home. They love Hadestown, which, despite the fact that it's a big hit, is a weird, strange musical. They love Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet. They love Ride the Cyclone. They love these really sort of more challenging pieces of musical theater, in particular, the queerness within them. What I'm finding really interesting about that is that Broadway hits are running forever now, and I think that's for a number of reasons, but I think dynamic pricing and the way in which tickets can be specifically priced on a day-by-day, seat-by-seat basis is giving these hits these really, really long runs, which means that the popular shows of the last 20 years are not shows that students can perform. They're never going to be able to be in Wicked or the Book of Mormon or Hamilton because these shows are going to run for another 20, 30 years, and we're not going to be able to get the rights to them. What's really interesting right now is that the shows that are not as big a hit, these pieces like Fun Home, which had a respectable though short run, A Strange Loop, which had a really short run, students can perform them. Students can get the rights to them. Students can do them with their theater companies. They can do them, in their clubs, their groups, their organizations. They can really ask us as their faculty to do them, and they are. And that's because they're the shows we can get the rights to right now. So I'm intrigued from like a 30-year generational perspective. If a generation from now, the fact that these Broadway hits were able to run forever because of these capitalist tools that suck every last cent out of the theater going public at the maximum amount, those shows are running so long that they're then not making it into ecosystems that are producing plays like colleges and universities, which are pushing our students towards a very, very different kind of theater that they're excited about. I'm really curious to see what that means in the long term. For me, in the short term, what it means, which is just like so exceptionally thrilling, is I have a group of undergraduates who are really, really excited by the work of Janine Tesori. We're really excited by the work of Michael Jackson, and that piece as a teacher aligns with where my interests lie. So I think that's really thrilling right now.
Yes, I'll just add on. My students love to hear about new plays. And so New Play Exchange has been a great resource for us, both to find scenes they want to direct in class, or to find monologues that they want to work on. Or I had students, we started this before rehearsal on Wednesdays. We would go to the dining hall, they would get their food, and we would sit in a room off to the side. They called it reading in the freezer because we were cold reading plays, but we would alternate who would pick a New Play Exchange piece, and we would sit with that play and we would read it out loud, and then we would go to rehearsal. And I've worked to continue this tradition because I think it's really interesting, and it helps me and students sort of keep up on, okay, who are these new playwrights that we, this, we read on HowlRound that there's this play that's happening at North Theater, New York, but we don't have access to this play yet. But this playwright wrote another piece, and so we can look at that. And so finding, I think, opportunities like this to look at new work, and to help students feel like they have their finger on the pulse of things that are happening outside of where we are. But also finding that sometimes students want to act in a different language, and it might be a language I don't know, but there are other people around me who know that language, and we can facilitate that student getting to act in that language, or that student getting to direct in that language. And so that is something that they've been interested in and I've been working with them to explore. It's easiest for me in Arabic, but we can make it work in other languages too, and that's been really fulfilling to say that, okay, yeah, let's see what this means. And also let's see what other students in the class who don't speak this language get out of this. It can be great to watch theater in different languages. Why not?
New work.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, if there's no other questions or comments from the room, I think we're at the end. We'll give you very few minutes back. Please step away from your computers and take a break from your screens. Well, thank you so much, Daphne, John, and Marina, for sharing your brilliance with all of us here today. Thank you, Ashley, for leading and shaping this session with me. And thank you to all of you who joined on the Zoom from ATHE or watched along on HowlRound TV. Again, if you want to talk to Ashley and I directly about anything HowlRound related, our emails are in the chat. They're just our first name at howlround.com. And I will also drop in the contribute content form in case this has inspired you to want to write or live stream or do something yourself on the platform. We'd love to hear from you. So enjoy the rest of your conference. Have a great day. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for creating a space for us to be able to share.
My gosh,
This
thank
work.
you.